Hello and welcome to Fin Business. Today we are in conversation with Neetu Chitkara from Boston Consultancy Group, and we are going to talk about risk, cybercrime and financial crimes. Neetu, welcome on the show.
Thanks, Amal.
So, interesting thing I would like to tell you is that whenever I look at innovation which is happening in the banking sector, what recollects me is the Frankenstein story. Frankenstein created this monster, but unfortunately he didn't know how to tame it. So monster was growing and it was really difficult for Frankenstein to control it. So when I look at the innovation in financial sector, when I look at the way the digital is growing, this story comes to my mind because many banks are coming with many innovative products, which is unfortunately leading to cyber risks. And the banking sector is unable to tackling this kind of frauds. I would like to learn from you how at BCG you would like to guide these banks to avoid, to prevent this kind of risks.
That's an interesting analogy that you took, right, in terms of seeing whether, and I think that's often the first thing that comes to people's mind when they think about that I'm moving towards more digital. You know, when I had files and all paper records, while all the problems which were there with those records, at least it couldn't be hacked.
Absolutely.
So people always felt that now with more and more data being digital and being available, let's say on the cloud, am I actually looking at more risk? I think what's interesting is it's actually not digitalization which is causing some of these risks. The problem is when you follow a siloed approach towards digital. So let me take an example of what I mean, right? If I'm thinking about all of these innovative products, what ends up happening is that I'm most of the time having these two different functions, and I've seen this play out quite often. I have the business who's really thinking about what's the most breakthrough thing out there, what's most innovative, what's most important for the customer. And then I have the CIO who is supposed to be the only person who's supposed to look at security, or I have the chief information security officer whose only job is security. And what ends up happening is there's always a tussle happening between the two, almost saying, or a trade-off, saying I'm going to do this, but this is going to lead to, so much issues in security. And more often than not, this tussle happen where at the very end when you're just about to launch the product, right? I think the answer to solve this is to actually have a more holistic approach as you think about digital, which means think about security right from the beginning. As you think about the product itself, at that time itself you involve the right set of people within technology. I think the challenge often what we find is that this cyber security is often taken as the topic which is owned by the CIO. It's not, and I think we as BCG firmly believe it needs to go to the CEO, the board. Those are the people, because frankly, if any cyber security related disaster happens, the people who are answerable is the CEO or the board. It's many CEOs who lose their jobs over this. So I think it's really important to think about cybersecurity in a holistic manner, get technology involved from the beginning, and I think then hopefully we can avoid this situation of the monster.
Interesting insights. Another interesting question for you now. If you look at Mumbai, which is the financial capital of India, people are actually frustrated with the traffic. If you go to Delhi, people are frustrated with the smog. And Europe, America and many other parts of country, including India and many other parts of the world, are frustrated and worried about terrorism. So smog, traffic, terrorism is the biggest killer, or the cybercrime, financial frauds.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an either or. I wouldn't like to be, dealing with any of them. But I think, again, I actually feel like if I look at natural disasters, right, I think floods, same, equally terrifying things which happen if I look at the world all over. I think the thinking about cybercrime has to be very similar, which is that many of these are now inevitable. It's not a question, if you are a company, it's not a question of if you will get hit. It's a question of when. And are you prepared for it? So if I talk about disaster recovery plan, many of us have disaster recovery plans for, let's say, fire, right? We have a fire drill and so on going on. But why don't we have cyber drills in organization? Why don't we sensitize our employees to say what happens if there is a breach and who is going to take what calls? So perhaps it needs to be at the same level of seriousness, which is for some of the other issues that you mentioned.
You used a very interesting term, very important term called cyber drills. But if I talk India specifically, do you believe that the people will go for cyber drills? And if not, what kind of activity BCG is planning to do on these terms of, are you advising actually your clients to boss there is a need of doing some activity like cyber drills?
Yeah, so I think what you find is nowadays there is more and more appreciation for some of these for cybersecurity, particularly in the banking sector, because here you find again we are dealing with a lot of data, we are dealing frankly with money. So even one loophole in the system can lead to losses of millions if not billions of dollars, right? So I think the sector is growing up quite a bit. What we find is, so we had done as BCG an exercise with the World Economic Forum where with the senior leaders we did a tabletop exercise where you actually run a simulation of how a cyber attack happens, how different information comes and how different people react to it. So it really puts you in the thick in the middle of a cyber crisis. When you try to, most exercises about cybersecurity are often made really technical. Within 2 minutes, they are, bound to get you off to sleep because there's so much jargon floating around. I think what we try to do is really think of it at a strategic level. So when I think about cyber drills or even anything or the tabletop exercises, which were really appreciated, it's because we are really thinking at the root cause of the issue. So if I were to give you a statistic, right, we've done an analysis of the major cyber breaches which have happened over the last few years. What you find is only 28%, so less than a third, happened because of inadequate IT infrastructure or IT related issues. More than 2/3 actually happen because of either people or process or organization related issues. And these are the issues which we need to be prepared to tackle and really think about as top management of an organization.
Very insightful information. On that front, if you look at the reports of your peers, for example, KPMG or Deloitte, or even if I'm not wrong, McKinsey and Ernst & Young, they publish these reports called fraud survey every year. And the best finding is this, that the employee is the most vulnerable person in an organization. Your data leak happens with your own employee. How to stop that?
No, I completely agree. So if I think about people issues, right, you look at Bangladesh Bank, which was one of the biggest cases in the financial institutions. Part of the reason, and it was $100 million of loss, part of the reason why they had a lot of time in trying to resolve it is because there were a set of holidays across Bangladesh,
so that was planned very well.
and then Philippines, which were the 3 countries involved. If I look at Target, which was a non-BFSI example, the employees even raised the alerts. So people in Bangalore knew, the information security team in Bangalore knew about the malware almost 15 days before it actually got stopped, and they had been raising it to people in Minneapolis. That's where, when you think about the people issues, you need to have real, who is actually manning or who is seeing the alerts which are coming from the systems. What is the escalation matrix on when these alerts are given, who is taking action on them? Do they have the right power and authority to take action on those calls? And I think that's where, when you think about BCG's approach when we advise our clients, is to say build this entire people and process organization in place so that getting the right alerts is still just basic table stakes. What do you do with that information is really important.
Keeping that Bangladesh incident in mind, looking at the holidays, it planned very well. There is no doubt that the hackers are more smart than the CIOs and the CTOs in the system. So will you advise banks to hire hackers?
So that's an interesting one, and there was a news last year where RBI actually did hire hackers to look at vulnerabilities in banks. And I think that's where, when I feel that yes, the sector is actually really thinking about changing their mindset. So for example, earlier and even today in some banks, the mindset is always, when you think about hacking or when you think about any incident, the first response is brush it under the carpet, deny it. It's always about this fear, and you will not talk about some of this. I think by bringing this out in the open and really saying, earlier I think the view used to be our systems are invincible, our teams are invincible. Again, people used to think we are not the one who's going to get hacked. I think now people are getting more and more acceptability. So that's where you say that with hackers, I don't think of them just as the enemy. There are some people, with ethical hacking, etc., where I can collaborate, where I can really help them to find issues in my system and plug those loopholes and really make it more robust.
True, and I believe that will be a key area going ahead, because if you come with openness, then perhaps we will share your problems. So, keeping all these things in mind, coming back to what hackers and what the hackers which RBI actually recruited, do you think that the bank should now come with a position like chief hackers officer or something like that. At least the big advantage will be when all the banks will hire all the hackers, there will be no one to hack
no
the
one
bank.
left to hack. That's not true, right? Because if you find the more and more, the hackers need not just be in India, they could be sitting in China and Russia. So I don't know if you can capture that whole pool well, but I see the you know, general direction of your question, and I completely agree. I think banks really need to think about, and not just about in their own system. So if I think about, even if there's a chief hacking officer within that system, that's still tackling part of the problem. I think the other part of the problem they need to look at is having a more, so one is the proactive approach. I think the other is more coordinated approach, because today, again, there's very limited information sharing. So I, as a bank, happen to have something, you know, some attack which happens to me. More often than not, the idea is to, you know, completely keep it hush-hush within the organization. So what ends up happening, and I'm going to try and simplify, is then the hacker goes to another bank and, you know, is actually replicating the exact same technique, right? So if you need to be more, as a system, need to be more resilient, there also needs to be a lot of coordination across the banks where, and some of that is happening. So RBI is also doing a lot of things to try to make this coordinated, but it needs to be a lot more proactive, so that as soon as we are seeing any attacks, we are actually alerting all the other parts of the system, and they are also prepared.
In your role at BCG, when you're advising a lot of clients, when you're actually looking and observing and reading the trends in the cyber attacks, what kind of nature have you observed in cyber attacks specifically in last 1 or 2 years?
So I think I would say two things. One, attacks growing wider and wider, and I think the other is ever changing. So I think what you find is it's a very dynamic field, so to say, right? If I talk about phishing, it's one of the oldest and most commonly used tricks in the book, where, you know, you're sending an email, someone opens that email, it has you know, some kind of attachment, and that leads to a malware in very simple terms being installed. Now imagine a different scenario where you get an email from the CEO of your company, you know, the CEO or India head, supposedly marked you know, urgent. At that point of time, how many people actually exercise the same you know, sort of caution? And what you realize is the hacker may have slightly changed the email ID or something. So if you're not careful enough, even if there's one person who didn't notice that change and actually opened that email, you know, that becomes the target, and with that you infiltrate the system. So that's called spear phishing, where you're actually not just, it's one level ahead of phishing, where now what you've done is got a lot more targeted, you've got a lot of information about the target, customized it, and you've also built an element of social engineering into it, meaning I've got an email from a super boss, so you know, I might as well,
you will tend to open it because it's the boss at the end of the day.
Exactly. So, you know, that's how the hackers are evolving to really build a lot of this social engineering and many of these elements into it.
Neetu, it was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for talking to Fin Business.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for watching.